So you may not have seen this slide or any reference to Imhotep in your textbook, but because we know that psychology's origins started in ancient Kemet with Psyche and the illumination of the human spirit, we have to talk about Imhotep, who is the father of medicine, an architect, an engineer, a philosopher, and one of the persons in ancient Kemet to talk about or to envision psychology or psyche as this illumination of the human spirit. Instead of starting with Imhotep, your textbook starts with the Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and these persons are important. It's just important to note that they were not the first. But they talked about psychological concepts like the nature of knowledge, reasoning, and emotion. And it's for this reason why we refer to philosophy as the grandfather or the the science or the field that predates psychology, rather, because philosophy is not a science. So then we have persons like Rene Descartes, who is a French philosopher, and you might be familiar with the term "I think, therefore I am." We can hold Descartes responsible for this philosophy, and he believed that the human mind, unlike the physical world, is not subject to laws. So basically, here we see with Descartes the beginning of the separation of the mind and the body. Okay? So then later we have John Locke, and John Locke believed that the human mind operated according to law. So basically, he said that the mind at the moment of birth is a tabula rasa. Tabula rasa, which means blank slate, right? So when we're talking about the nature versus nurture debate, John Locke would be really strongly on the nurture side, saying that he don't care what come from your mommy, what come from your daddy. When you're born, everything that you learn or every behavior that you then project or display, rather, is a result of the things that you got in the circumstances that you're in your nurturing. Then we have Thomas Hobbes, who comes in the 17th century and continues to separate the mind and the body and the soul, so much so that he claimed that things such as the soul and the spirit and the mind are meaningless. Okay, so we see his theories or his philosophies coming up later in the field of psychology as we start looking at the behaviorists. And then we have Charles Darwin. And you may be familiar with Charles Darwin as the person responsible for the theory of evolution and attribute that to biology. But Darwin's theories are also important in psychology because he took the position that behavior also evolves, right? The survival of the fittest. So now we move into the new psychology, a science of the mind. And we see that we're no longer in the realm of philosophy because in 1879, Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig, Germany, opened up the first psychology lab. And in it, he was looking at attention, which is actively controlled by intentions and motives. And this is the field of psychology that we came to know as voluntarism. And so after Wundt, we saw Titchener. And Titchener was looking at the field of psychology that we called structuralism. And it was called structuralism because he was trying to take persons' experiences and break them down into the tiniest units of understanding, right? So when you see a banana, for example, what is it that you see? How does it feel? How does it taste? What does it smell like? And break all of those units of experiences down into the smallest parts. And then seeing that all of those tiny units help us to understand behavior. William James then came along and he was like, I don't think those tiny units of experience is really what it is that we need to be looking at when we're talking about psychology. He was focused more on functionalism, right? And this is how individuals use their perceptual abilities to adapt and function in their environment. So he was more interested in how things all fit together in the flow of our understanding. And he is kind of one of the persons that we associate with this idea of a stream of consciousness, right? That ideas all work together to function in their environment. And then ending our science of the mind is probably the most infamous or famous, depending on your perspective, psychologist of them all, Sigmund Freud. And he is the father of psychodynamic psychology. And this is the idea that behavior results from psychological factors that interact within the individual. So when we say within the individual, we're also saying that Freud believed that most of our behavior is the result of unconscious motives. And he also believed that those motives are primarily sexual and aggressive in nature and will lead you at some point in your psychosexual development, if you're a young man, to want to kill your father so you can have your mother all to yourself. Yeah, but I'm sure you'll talk about that a lot later when we get to personality psychology chapter in the text. So we move from the science of the mind. So what we want to note now is that each stage of psychology is sort of a rejection of the stage that came before it. So psychology started off as the science of the mind, right? Things that were in that nebulous space that we can't really touch called the mind. And then you had the behaviorists come along like Watson and Skinner, and they basically said, listen, all of that mind stuff is foolishness. Psychology is only that which can be observed and measured. And so we had this era of psychology that focused on behavior, things that we can touch, feel, and see only, and kind of abandoned the era of the mind. So after a while of strong behaviorism, we moved to the cognitive revolution. And the cognitive revolution is saying, hey, the mind is actually still important. And cognitive revolution focused on issues of cognition, right? Thinking, feeling, sensing. And Gestalt psychology is in this revolution, and it studies how people perceive and experience objects as whole patterns. And Gestalt is a German word for whole, so that's why you see the whole patterns coming up in this definition of Gestalt psychology. Also in the cognitive revolution, we have humanistic psychology and, of course, cognitive psychology. And so humanistic psychology is a more friendly psychology, especially when we look at it in regards to psychodynamic psychology that views people primarily as sensually um, uh, egotistical and hedonistic. Humanistic psychology looks at people and the goodness of them and tries to focus on how people can realize their full human potential, while cognitive psychology comes in and is devoted to the mental processes in its most broadest sense. So, where are we now in terms of the fields of psychology? Where are we now? Our new directions include evolutionary psychology. So, remember when we were talking about Darwin? Yeah. We're taking his theory of evolution and applying it now to psychology. Okay? So this is psychology that is concerned with the evolutionary origins of behaviors and mental processes, their adaptive value, and the purposes they continue to serve. So basically, what behaviors do human beings exhibit now that have been adopted over time that have allowed us to survive? For example, our flight or flight response. How has that helped in the survival of human beings? Then we also have positive psychology, which focuses on positive experiences, self determination, the relationship between positive emotions and physical health. So basically, it looks at persons from a health and strength based perspective as opposed to a deficit perspective that more traditional areas of psychology tend to approach individuals from. But most psychologists today don't really focus on one specific field. They take from different areas and combine them to work in the ways that they need them to for their context. So, I, for example, am a community psychologist, but I'm also a Black psychologist, and I'm also enjoy things about feminist psychology and cognition and evolutionary psychology. And so I pull all of those things into my understanding of human beings' mental processes and behavior. Human diversity. Why learn about human diversity in psychology? Well, because psychologists have begun to examine assumptions based on gender, race, culture, and all of the things that make us unique as humans, as individuals, all of these different factors. As we talk more about human diversity, I just want to point out that it's important for psychologists in all the various fields to really understand diversity. We may think that it's only important for the counselors who are dealing with individuals and mental health and their specific problems, but it's also important for social psychologists looking at questions as how does gender influence people's willingness to help, or experimental psychologists looking at how might gender or does race play a role on person's perceptions. So, diversity is important all around. And as we talk about diversity, we see differences in individualistic cultures and then collectivist cultures. Individualistic cultures are cultures that value independence and personal achievement. So they value people who pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, who make a way out of no way, who strive and achieve, who at 18 move out of their parents' houses and go and get a job. So personal achievements are valued specifically in individualistic cultures. The emphasis is placed on the strength of the individual, while collectivist cultures value interdependence, fitting in, and harmonious relationships. So these would be cultures in which people probably stay at home a little bit longer, cultures in which it is taboo to bring shame to one's family or community, so you want to fit in, cultures in which the group is valued over the person. So we see things or philosophies like Ubuntu, which state I am because we are. So, question for you, which one do you think the Bahamas is? Is the Bahamas an individualistic culture, or do you think we're more of a collectivist culture? So, the definition of culture that I like to use is the one by Wade Nobles, which states that culture is that which gives humans a general design for living and a pattern for interpreting reality. And so here we see that culture is like the glasses through which we see the world. It's dynamic and it's contested, meaning that culture is always changing and people are always arguing about what culture is, right? So, culture to humans is like water is to this little fish in this fish bowl. It's all around us. It consumes everything that we do, or everything that we do takes place within the culture, but we're not necessarily consciously aware of how the culture is affecting us until we're taken out of it. So let's look at some other aspects of diversity, particularly race and ethnicity. Now, the definition of race that we see here is a subpopulation of a species defined according to an identifiable characteristic that is geographic location, skin color, hair texture, genes, facial features, and so forth. But ethnicity is a common cultural heritage, including religion, language, or ancestry that is shared by a group of individuals. So, I, for example, being Bahamian, my race would be black and my ethnicity would be Bahamian. But race is, as we see from this definition, a really complicated construct because varied uh, ideas around race and gender, according to your text, is a psychological and social meaning attached to being biologically male or female. So here we really want to note that one's sex is what you are biologically born as, male or female, but one's gender, right, is the psychological and social meaning that one attaches to this biology. So, what does it mean psychologically or socially for someone to be a man or for someone to be a woman? Does that definition change based on where they are defining the construct of man and woman, right? What does it mean to be a Bahamian man or a Bahamian woman versus what it means to be a man in Afghanistan or a woman in Afghanistan? Gender stereotypes play a role in the psychological and social meaning attached to gender because these are beliefs about typical male or female behavior roles. What are some Bahamian gender stereotypes? Do we have any? Are you aware of what they are? Well, feminist psychology takes a look at these stereotypes, takes a look at the definitions of gender as well as sex, and focuses on a wide variety of views on the social roles of women and men, the problems and rewards of those roles, and prescriptions for changing those roles. Sexual orientation, then, is the direction of one's sexual interest towards members of the same sex, the other sex, or both sexes. So note that when we're talking about sexual orientation, that gender is really nowhere in that definition. So that one's sexual orientation and one's gender are two totally different constructs. So why do we have such great ideas around gender? It all boils down to the fact that both gender and race are social constructs. And social constructs are social mechanisms or phenomenons or categories created and developed by society, a perception of an individual, group, or idea that is constructed through cultural or social practice. So basically, what this means is that the definition of a social construct is based solely on the perceptions of those within the society. The constructs themselves are therefore not real, and they're not real because they change depending on where you are. So while the constructs may not be real, their implications are. So I can say, oh, well, race is just a social construct and race doesn't really tell you anything about who I am as a person. But if I'm driving at night in a car and I'm in the small town in the United States and a police officer pulls me over, my race as well as my gender are probably going to influence very significantly the interactions that that police officer has with me. How do you think race and gender are, the implications of them are in Bahamian society?